I'm S.A. Bradley, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror, where I remind you that you used to love horror movies, and you secretly still do.
I was thinking about the first ghost that I ever encountered, which does fit kind of the classical ghost story model, where it's like something that you did wrong and you're being haunted around it. So when I was about 10 years old, we had this cat. And the cat would always, scratch the back of the couch, like a cat would do. Mm-hmm. It was a very distinctive sound. And what happened to this cat was that it died in, a tragic accident where my mom didn't know it was in the dryer and started the dryer. Right, and ended up just, it was just mangled. You got to take it, put it down kind of thing.
Right.
And,
no fabric softener is going to fix
No. This is a tragic death on the premises. And then, not too long after that, I would start hearing the sound of a cat and scratching the back of the couch. And on some level, I was like, that's the ghost of that cat. And of course, at the same time, we go, well, is that the ghost of that cat, or am I just sort of inferring the noise? Maybe it's just, I'm making that up. I don't know. But about 20 years later, I'm talking to my sister about it, and she goes, and we've never had this discussion before. It's not something I ever wanted to talk to, with a family member about, at that point, I didn't think you could talk to people about your ghost experiences, right? And my sister out of the blue she goes, yeah, I remember when we had that cat. She goes, yeah, I used to hear the ghost of that cat scratching the back of the couch. And it's that's a interesting, just a two-person, but it's the confirmation of someone else having that same experience.
Yeah.
And it's never been discussed.
And we're here in a basement complex
seriously.
In San Francisco. And what a perfect place for us to talk about ghosts and monsters.
Yeah.
And we're talking about vampires, ghosts, and werewolves. And these monsters can be found in one form or another in the folklore of many cultures around the globe. Now, these monsters are normally considered metaphors for different things in different cultures, but did you know that they also stood in for medical diagnoses for diseases and mental illnesses? And the cure for the illness was oftentimes the way to kill the monster in folklore. Today on the show, I'm joined by author Julie Vayda, who is also a folklore enthusiast and a researcher of medical history. Julie is going to talk about monsters and medicine with us. Julie, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, you are looking at medical history.
Yeah.
And you're also a student of folklore.
Right.
And both of those things together have given you a certain perspective of looking at monsters. Describe that a little bit.
Well, I don't know that a lot of this stuff would have come up if I maybe only been looking at things through one angle. I only look at folklore, or I only look at medicine, or I only look at history and through a really narrow lens. But because I'm coming to a lot of these topics from having researched other topics, it's interesting to see where they come together, and maybe connections that would be missed by someone who was just coming from one of those backgrounds.
So is there a connective tissue between these two things, where we're talking about folklore and medicine?
I guess the connective tissue there would just be the need for human beings to be able to pass down knowledge in a way that's going to be understood by the person that they're passing it down to, which might not be the modern person, because the modern person doesn't immediately think, oh, there's an illness, let me go get garlic silver and a book of matches.
Right. Right. Is there what fascinated you about these two subjects that allowed this marriage to come? Is there one thing that stood out in the medical history, and then it made you look at folklore? Which came first, chicken or the egg?
Definitely the folklore came first. I was the kid who wanted to know, is there a Bigfoot? And if so, how does that work? Are there ghosts? Are there pirate ships?
Did you have the occult encyclopedias where Time Life used to sell these books?
I have them upstairs.
You have them upstairs?
I have them upstairs.
What's the coolest folklore that you remember? What was the folklore that you went, I gotta look at more of this? What was the surprise? Like for me, it was learning that Ring Around the Rosie had to do with the plague.
Oh, yeah.
And so I was like, that's fascinating. And then I needed to
Definitely.
know more.
Like, what a good rhyme for children.
Right. It's a children's thing. The kids start falling down. They're spinning. And ashes.
Right. So anything, kind of old-timey and folklore was always fascinating to me. And then, so look, like, getting into medieval history and witches and herbs and potions and ointments, and then moving from that into looking at, like, medical herbology, or how is it, and then studying medicine, and anything to do with just sort of human culture is fascinating to me. So in the book, and then how do we keep yourself healthy? Well, that's just a really basic thing, isn't it? Like, and diseases are fascinating to me. You know, I don't get a lot of second dates because I think, did you hear about that super gonorrhea? Is a really fascinating question.
Yeah, right.
So,
well, what's the top 3 sexy diseases right now?
Right now? Oh, God. The top 3 sexy diseases. The ones that are terrible that, like, we don't even know how to deal with.
Right.
Or, like, oh, God, Zika?
Zika virus.
That's fucking frightening, right?
Right.
Okay. Well, yeah, drug-resistant gonorrhea. Oh, God. You think you can just go down to the clinic and have that taken care of. Nope.
Right. I love that we're laughing.
I know.
Drug-resistant
Hilarious. Right? Oh, yeah, a lot of people don't even know that Ebola is sexually transmitted.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Or did I? No, I didn't. It's not only sexual.
Not only, but they do think that that's responsible for why it will suddenly have, like, a recurrence.
Oh, got it.
Yeah.
I'm kind of the same way, is that when I was a kid, my dad got me a series of Funk and Wagnall encyclopedias and just said, here, welcome to summer, read this.
Oh, yeah.
And I just kind of went crazy. Everything that I looked up made me look at something else. And what I tended towards was the things that frightened me. So I did look up the world's largest spider, and I did need to know the disease that was really scary. And then I started getting into a little bit of the folklore, and it sounds to me like that curiosity is also in you, and also makes it hard for people who are not involved in that. Because I talk like this all the time.
If you've been diagnosed with some sort of a syndrome where there's a lot of question marks about how you got it, it's probably a virus.
Right.
Right.
So we've just been talking about ghosts, and we both grew up in different areas of the country, but we both have same kind of ghost stories, really. And across the world, you'll hear different ghost stories. Some places the ghosts are a little bit more friendly. Sometimes they mean different things. But when we first started talking about ghosts and monsters, because you are working on some fascinating research around medicine, you mentioned something that was called the realities of monsters. You use that term. So what do you mean by that term? What does that mean, realities of monsters?
Well, when you look at these sort of reports of monsters in history, they often come along with some, like if let's say a plague hits, and people don't really know what causes the plague, and the theory that gets come up with is, oh, Grandpa's rotting corpse has risen up from the ground and is going around and sucking blood from us in the middle of the night. You know, the vampire story. And the original vampires, they are not sexy. They are basically rotting, shambling corpses. Like, they are gross, and, like, no one would be attracted to them, right? Like, it's only until later where they sort of get turned into a, I don't know, metaphor for the aristocracy or something like that. But, they're originally, like, they're not anything that anyone would want to keep around or sympathize with. I mean, the same thing with werewolves. Like, werewolves start out as just, like, people having a fear of wolves. And then there was, the reality of having people actually being killed by wolves. Like, that was a problem.
Right.
And then, it wasn't like the wolf man. It was just like a person who may or may not be turning into an actual wolf and running around.
So when we talk about monsters being used as like a medical diagnosis, in other words, somebody says, "Oh, you've got ghosts."
Right.
What time periods are we talking about?
We're specifically talking about Europe in the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance. That's where it's kind of what we're looking at.
Okay. How about Asia? Because Asia has a whole different feel about ghosts, right?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that oftentimes when you hear about in the Asian cultures talk about like hungry ghosts or something like that, they have a sense that they're talking about actual ghosts, but there's almost a sense that there is a more kind of implicit we're talking about people's psychological needs. It's like more the case. Or at least that's always been my impression of it.
Okay. So one of the things that was really interesting that you talked about, there's a cat in here?
Oh my god.
So
Excuse
really
me, we
loud.
have to let the cat in.
Go ahead.
I'd like to talk about cats at some point in this episode too.
Sure.
Because we're going to get into diseases. And I don't know if you know about this, but the toxoplasmosis that infects cats and then infects people and is maybe implicit in a lot of like weird brain conditions that we have. So that's interesting to me that shows up in the history of folklore of like cats, witches having cats and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. So we've been gifted another guest. We have a cat who has come in, and the cat was being really loud and needed to be loved.
He needs a lot of attention.
So how about cats when we're talking about medicine and old wives' tales and folklore? How do cats fit in on like the folklore itself, witches and things like that, and actual disease?
Well, so cats kind of show up a lot in folklore on a couple of levels. One thing is that we know now is that they are responsible for infecting our brains with things that may actually cause weird behaviors, cause suicide, schizophrenia, all kinds of weird stuff. It's actually just a parasite that you get from the cat, which is really weird, and we're still finding out about that. But then there's also this kind of tradition in history of, you read in the folklore about people keeping cats, not just for the rat catching aspect, which is part of keeping diseases down, is getting people to getting cats to catch the rats and other rodents, but also you see in the folklore about people keeping cats because cats are specifically sensitive to supernatural entities and essentially will like work as a filter to help to keep them down in your house.
Really?
Like, yeah.
Say that again?
That's part of why you always get, I think that you get the relationship between witches keeping cats. Of course, everybody kept cats because they needed to keep the mice down. Mm-hmm. Like, that's just in the same way...
We're talking more about Europe.
Yeah, we're talking about Europe. In the same way that you would keep a vacuum cleaner, you would keep a cat, right? Like, that's just... But there's a lot that you'll see written down about how people would keep cats because cats are considered to be... there are certain cats that are sensitive to the presence of ghosts, specifically, and other kinds of entities like that. And I had even before reading about this in the folklore, I had a cat who would give a special meow, and then I'd be like, okay, what's going on? And I would look up and I would see it's like a ghost or an entity. I'm like, oh, okay. So there's some people that are sensitive to these things. There's cats that are sensitive to them too. And it makes sense that they would kind of end up together. So I think that's where you get the whole thing with the witch and the witch's familiar. And of course they were doing crazy things in the Renaissance, like hanging cats for being witches and dogs
right.
and pigs. Like
right.
You know.
So a lot of the stuff that they're talking about, the actions that are being done. If you hear this little crunching every so often, that is the cat actually clawing at the carpet,
which is exactly the noise that I was talking about hearing earlier of a ghost cat.
Oh, really?
Just that noise.
Well, now you have it, folks.
In case you were wondering. The noise of a cat scratching.
So I think what's interesting is that we probably only found out about the bacterium that's in cats that can cause insanity in people pretty recently, but they've kind of had an understanding of that in a weird folklore way,
right?
And kind of using it in a medicinal value, or cats in a medicinal value, or in a maintenance value around the house,
right?
For a lot longer than that. So I guess what I'm getting at is that it's interesting to me that even though they were hanging pigs and all this stuff, there was a method to the madness that was kind of on point, right?
Right.
So I think what I want to talk about now is some of that stuff that's a little bit more towards folklore that people are aware of, like vampires.
Yeah,
you mentioned
absolutely.
vampires before. And, I mean, there's so many different types. In India, there's the Vitalas. Asia has Tagalog Manganduro is the female bloodsucker. Yeah. And like you said, they weren't always called vampires, and they certainly weren't pretty. A lot of times they were the undead making more undead. And sometimes they sucked blood, and sometimes they didn't. Now, I think even though there's the vampires are rather different in different areas, we still pretty much see the same kind of cures, right? Or ways to get rid of them.
Yeah, so this is the kind of thing that only occurred to me because I've had the interest in folklore for a long time. You know, these monsters are fascinating. These creatures are fascinating. Folklore in general is fascinating. And then at the same time, like being into like, weird medical research. And so you come across something like, well, how do you kill a vampire? How do you kill a werewolf? Obviously, with anything, people are aware that if you cut its head off, it's pretty much done. Like you need an intact spine to keep shambling around, you know, taking people's blood or whatever. But the thing that kind of clued me in was with a lot of these monsters, the cure is silver, right? You ward them off with silver, or you shoot them with a silver bullet, and it's like, well, why would that be? And the answer is that people were using silver for diseases. They already knew that. They may not have had the concept of germ theory, but they understood, like, if I pour my water into a silver pitcher and I eat with silver utensils, we don't get sick. Or we get less often, or people are still using colloidal silver to treat, infections and things like that. And up until the rise of antibiotics, it was the most commonly used microbial agent, like in hospitals. And then I also read recently that they're starting to bring back the use of silver because of the rise of antibiotic-resistant diseases. So it's not even just some sort of like hokey folklore remedy. It's like, no, we actually have to take this seriously. So it kind of stands to reason that if you have this sort of mysterious plague and you don't know what's causing it, but yet you even if you think it's a vampire that's doing it, the thing that you know that works for people getting sick would be the thing to ward off the vampire.
Right. So we have metaphor and medical actually
that there's
coming
actual
together.
Information in there.
Yeah. So they're using actual medicinal value objects in the folklore, and the folklore itself is kind of a metaphor for whatever they're afraid of at that time. So it may have been a plague, it may have been a weird sickness.
That's right.
What about garlic?
So garlic is interesting because in the folklore you get it's that strings of garlic are going to keep vampires away from you. Well, why would they? Right? Like, but what we know about garlic is that it's used. You can use it medicinally. Again, it's antibacterial. It's specifically antiparasitic, which if you have the concept of like creatures living in you, sucking your life force out, parasites are a pretty good 1-to-1 on that.
Right,
so,
in contact.
Yeah, in contact. Yeah, so garlic is antiparasitic. It's antibacterial. You can use it to get rid of a cold. Like it's like you could. In terms of categories of things that it's good for getting rid of, anything that you might get is a general infection. It's great for that. So it's like, oh, okay, what do we have that almost everyone has that's good for people getting sick? Okay, break out the garlic.
Right.
It's just that, to me, it's just like that general information that's encoded in there.
So as opposed to like we don't think that when we're 10 years old.
Right.
We're like, that's pretty random. Garlic,
right. It's pretty random,
why is
right?
that happening? And now you've kind of given the reason for that. How about salt? Why is a circle of salt or salt?
It's pretty fascinating. Or sprinkling salt over your shoulder to get rid of the devil, kind of. And again, it's the same thing. Salt is antibacterial. You put salt in a wound, it's going to burn, but it's not going to get infected either. I mean, and the other thing about salt is that it was super, super expensive. Like it was a precious commodity at one point. And it would have to be traded all over the place, but salt was really key for preserving food. So again, just like with silver, it's like it comes into the keeping your food from giving you food poisoning, essentially. So I think that was how salt comes in. It was like we think of salt as like, oh, there's table salt, we might enjoy it or not, but it was like a key thing for both preservation and just not getting sick.
They used to pay people in salt.
Yeah, exactly. That's how important it was.
And a major commodity.
Yeah.
And clean water.
Clean water.
Is there anything that we have holy water for vampires. Is there any kind of indication of how it went from just clear water, clean water, and silver to holy water? Or is there even a thing about water?
I think the holy water in the process comes in mostly when they start making vampire movies. It's like this just sort of visual representation. But you do see in the folklore that vampires can't cross running water.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, why wouldn't they be able to swim, right? Like that. Right. Why does that make sense? Well, if you think about it, running water is, if you're trying to like clear a pathogen out of an area, running water over it it's going to significantly dilute that. I mean, we still wash our hands as like a, after taking out the garbage or before a meal or whatever. And how much is it really going to do? Well, even on a psychological level, we think, running water over it is going to protect us from, the worst possible things.
So you see the idea that vampires can't cross over water as being a kind of another metaphor of, hey, we're warding off a danger or a disease.
Yeah, we're protecting ourselves from a danger or disease by having a river flow through there. Or, yeah, absolutely. What's the other one? Fire.
Yeah, let's talk fire.
Let's talk fire.
Yeah. We gotta talk fire. I mean,
kill it with fire. No, and that's the thing. It's like, if you want to sterilize something, what are you going to use?
Fire, of course.
Fire was going to pretty much do it every time.
So, where did you see? Well, first off, monsters tend to always be afraid of fire.
Right.
Light for your vampires as well. Mm-hmm. You can keep a werewolf at bay with a torch, things like that.
Sunlight. Sunlight's another one. You want to sterilize something, put it out in the sunlight.
Yeah. So, with fire, where do you tell me about the medicinal values and how that tended to go into folklore?
I don't know if there's a lot about using fire like as a medicine, except in the sense of you're using it to sterilize tools and things like that.
Well, what about the fires during the plague? I mean, how did we fight the plague?
I mean, at some point, some people figured out that they might not have had germ theory down, but they figured out that you could essentially kill things with fire. So there's a
revolutionary thinking.
What a concept! So they figured at some point there is a theory that the Great Fire of London was partially started by people trying to contain the plague. Mm-hmm. They still hadn't figured out how the plague spreads or what it actually is, but they knew that if you're like, okay, there's a bunch of sick people in that part of town, maybe if we set it on fire, it'll stop spreading.
Urban renewal starting very early.
Right.
So I wanted to talk a little bit more about ghosts, because one of the things we talked about before was that they're in every culture and they're a little bit different how they interact. Like when I used to watch, I still do watch a lot of J-horror, and a lot of how ghosts are dealt with and what the expectations are of ghosts is a lot different than what we see in some Western culture films. And when you were doing some research on Chinese medicine, and you went to some old Chinese medical textbooks, you basically found ghost as like a symptom or a disease.
Oh, yeah. As in like, the patient exhibiting these symptoms, they must be bothered by ghosts. Like, and it's not like, oh God, the house is haunted, you have to get, it's like, okay, so you've got some ghosts and we need to treat that. Right. Like, it's sort of a more factual thing, and the symptoms that you see are like what we would now ascribe to, like, this person has a mental illness.
Can you give an example?
I mean, it's a lot of what might be classified as a bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. Okay. It's like, they're having a hallucination, or there's the kinds of things that you would see as mental illness symptoms. But they would have diagnosed it as this person is bothered by ghosts.
Right. And you said something about the diagnosis being, what's fascinating is that it's the same.
Right. Like
everywhere.
There's like this series in acupuncture. There's a series of points that are called the ghost points that would have been used to treat someone who's bothered by ghosts. Well, they still use the same points just to treat your mental illness. So it's like, even though we have the theory about why you're affected is different, it's like the treatment is the same, which is fascinating to me. There was one, like, I thought it was funny that there's this great classic of Chinese herbal medicine, there was this like one genius, and he wrote this book, and he's talking about all the herbs, and he gets to the marijuana plant, and he's like, it makes you see ghosts. Like, like, well, it must have been a bad day for him when he stumbled on that plant and experimented with it. But yeah, there's like less of a sense that having ghosts is this horrible, tragic thing of you did something wrong or
right.
But I think it's maybe the Chinese are kind of used to living with the ancestors. It's like that's a part of their daily life, so it's not like something went wrong because they're here. It's more just something's out of harmony with the relationship, maybe.
Right. That's something that I think is interesting when we talk about like traditional ghost stories. It's usually, and I talk about ghost stories like it's like small claims court. You've got somebody, an aggrieved party from beyond the grave.
But it's usually it's following some tragic, horrible story.
Yeah, some terrible story.
It's just
but it can be rectified.
Sure.
Correct. And it's almost as if it's like unfinished business. We talk about ghosts as unfinished business, but it's a little bit different in Asia. It's not that at all.
Right.
So, why do you think ghosts show up where there are psychological issues, or why do you think that is where people went? Psychological issues. I mean, certain areas are going to call it demons, right?
That's right.
But a lot of times it's going to be ghosts. What is it about ghosts, or the I don't know if it would be the romanticism of ghosts, but the idea of ghosts that made people go, okay, we've got an illness here that needs to get taken care of.
Well, the thing about ghosts is that they're not physical. The idea is that they don't take up space, and they're not tangible in the way that a vampire or a werewolf or something like that would be, where you can just go find it and kill it and take care of the problem. It's like, it's this more ephemeral thing that has to be addressed. And I mean, we talk about, we still use like the terminology of like, someone has been haunted by something that happened to them.
Right.
Like it's not too far apart to talk about someone having a ghost that's bothering them, and let's say someone having like PTSD. Right. There's a thing that occurred, there was a trauma, and it's taken on like a life of its own, and it has to be dealt with. Which is a pretty good definition of a ghost to me.
So it's interesting that you say that, because when we talk about vampires, and we'll also be talking about werewolves, that's more of a physical manifestation.
Absolutely.
But we have this metaphysical or emotional.
Or we would call it psychological now.
Yeah, psychological. So ghosts are more on the psychology of medicine when we're talking about this, and the other two are basically more of what is happening to the body in particular.
Yeah.
So what's the idea, and you may not have an answer for this, but ghosts, a lot of times in Western culture, it's like, return the bones to the graveyard, and then the ghost will be at rest. Is there anything why is that even a thing? Why would someone even come up with that as an idea? Oh, the bones have been moved, and now we have to move the bones back.
I think that has something to do with religious ideas about proper burial.
Proper burial.
Yeah. You hear about like someone didn't get buried in holy ground or consecrated ground, and then there's a problem. Well, the idea is you must be buried in the proper manner, or there will be a problem. I think that has more to do with that.
Okay.
People's ideas about where it happens to you after you die, where do you go, and the thing like it's like things have to be put in their proper place,
right?
Or you'll be stuck with this sense of like you would say unfinished business. Well, in that case, their entire unfinished business is not being in the right ground.
Right.
Or, which like really?
Yeah. Thanks.
You're gonna waste your entire afterlife whining about not being in the right ground? No, but like that's the point of that is you have to put people in the right place.
Right.
So
since we're talking about the emotional, the behavioral issues, one of the things that I've been finding out in my readings is that a lot, especially around horror, because I ask people why do they watch horror a lot.
Okay.
And a lot of what I've heard is when people are depressed, when they're not feeling well, they tend to go towards some of the darker stuff. And for some folks, not all behaviors, but it seems like depression tends to have the need for horror is not like a cure, but it's something that people go to. Is there anything in medical history, where that's kind of something that people see, where there is, like, I think it was called a melancholy part of your garden. If you were gardening, there's a spot for certain emotions.
You would build a kind of intentionally creepy and melancholy part of the garden, so and that's where you would go when you were struck with melancholia, or we would call it depression now. I think there was less of a sense that you had to try to shake yourself out of it. It's more like, oh, well, you better go into that emotion now. Go sit with it. Go sit with it. Be in it, so that you can then come back out of it. But
that's one of the things that I talk about with horror, is that I look at it as kind of, you're going towards the shadow self.
Okay.
And it's not fixing the shadow self. It's basically just connecting with it for that moment, and that there is a kind of feel in Western culture that we need to fix a bad emotion,
right,
as opposed to learning to live with it. So do you think that when we're talking about ghosts, different relationships with ghosts across different parts of the world, that kind of feeling about how we feel about our own dark self comes into play?
I mean, I'm sure it does.
I wonder about that, because I'm thinking about talking about the werewolf in a little bit, and the werewolf is all about losing control, right?
Right. Well, I was just thinking, like, before we kind of came up with modern psychological diagnoses, I mean, if you were like clinically depressed, I'm trying to think, like, what would you think it was that was happening to you? I mean, they had a term for it. They're like, oh, you have melancholia, but it's not too far off the mark that I would like say maybe this person would feel like they've been haunted by something.
Right.
It's like, why are you so depressed that you don't want to get out of bed? It's like, well, maybe there's something bothering you. Right? Maybe it's not a ghost per se, but that there's something outside of yourself that's giving you a hard time, essentially.
Right. Were there specific quote-unquote cures for such things? I mean, if we're manifesting it as a ghost, and we're looking at it as a medical issue, a ghost, this guy is a ghost, was there anything that you can think of that was being done for that? I mean, we have salt, we have garlic, we have silver. Is there anything that was being done for this specific thing, which is more ethereal?
Well, I remember at one point hearing that during the Middle Ages, the cure for depression was flogging. So...
For some of us, it still is.
Well, right, and which we know a lot about, how to trigger certain neurochemicals and so on some level, and music was the other one. So it's like anything you can do to sort of change the brainwave state would have been considered a cure for that.
Okay. Do you think, and this is more curiosity than anything else, because I've heard so many people go, and people who aren't even big horror fans say, I either want to watch something blow up or I want to watch something scary when I'm feeling down, when I've had a really bad day. Do you think that there's anything, a correlation?
I don't know, maybe they would go watch a hanging or something, but...
well, I think I was getting at the idea of having a chemical change in your body as opposed to watching someone else get flayed. Although I'm sure on a slow Sunday that probably, is really high up there. Just think of like what the TV guide, their version of the TV guide was. We got 15 torture chambers and there's nothing on.
Right.
Not one good stretching happening on Sunday nights these days, I'll tell you.
Oh my God.
The vicar's going to have to do some heavy dirty work. But I was thinking more on that chemical change. I think you mentioned this when we were originally talking too, that there is... people could get that from a roller coaster, right?
Right, absolutely.
But there's
you can call it acute stress.
Acute stress. So
that you definitely would get it from watching a horror movie. Something that's acutely scares you, like not like, well, this is really spooky, but like.
Right, or you're really nervous.
Yes.
And you get to the acute level.
Right, or like going on a roller coaster, it's that.
Right, and you're saying that there's a chemical.
There are some indications that kind of acute stress has an extremely positive effect on the nervous system, or the immune system. Okay, like it stimulates you into suddenly producing white blood cells, so that you're suddenly like more able to fight off infections. As opposed to chronic stress, which is real bad for you.
Right.
So
just the occasional good jolt.
Right. Is actually has a positive effect.
So I said we were going to talk about werewolves, and when you started talking about their the immune system and talking about once again we're getting out of the head and we're going into the body.
Right.
When we talk about werewolves, the whole idea of the bite and the curse and the madness, it's kind of like the two things together. There's a madness that's kind of associated, but there's also a physical like infection.
I mean, I think there are definitely specific illnesses that. I mean, if an animal bites you and you come down with rabies or something like that, and then you have that kind of madness. And then I read a paper recently that indicates that the werewolf and the witch hysterias of the early Renaissance came in right at the same time as like lots of people were getting syphilis.
Right.
So and they hadn't quite figured out what it was yet or how you got it But there were, a physical symptom, and then at some point, a lot of people started acting crazy, because they got it in their brain and they went insane. That's just it sort of shows up at the same time.
And without the frame of reference, without knowing that there was such a, I'm not sure. I have no idea about the history of sexually transmitted diseases, but I would assume that there wasn't when syphilis hit. That was probably because it's so well known. It's still around. Right. It must have been one of those that really kind of spread like wildfire.
Oh yeah,
it was
definitely
powerful.
Did. It definitely did.
So without knowing what it is, it must have been. By the time you realize that there's a connection, it must be close to epidemic.
Oh yeah. One of the things that I thought of is that we have this, it's not a big deal now, right? Like I have a friend who got syphilis like 3 times last year. Whatever, you get your antibiotics.
3 times?
Yeah, I know, right? But like, I know, it's a little bit like, really? Come on now. Like, they're not Pokemon, you don't have to catch them all. But like, come on, it's just, we know how to prevent these things. But at the same time, it's like, whatever, you go to the doctor, they give you antibiotics, and you don't have any more. But on some level, before they quite figured out germ theory, the idea that like there's a werewolf or a vampire or some sort of physical monster that's causing everyone to get sick is almost maybe more comforting than that there's just sort of this amorphous thing that you don't know how you get it and it just can happen at any time and you're dead. Like, because you could go find that thing and cut off its head or burn it down and problem solved.
And yet there's real life cures for a metaphoric monster.
Right.
That's also good for a real life
disease. That's right.
So with a werewolf, obviously we talk about silver bullets before, or silver.
Yeah.
But now we're talking about wolfsbane. What is it about wolfsbane?
So wolfsbane comes into the werewolf lore, but the actual history is that it's a poisonous plant. And they were using it specifically to kill wolves. Like, that's its history. Back to the ancient Greeks, who were like, putting wolfsbane on their arrows and going out and hunting wolves. So obviously it does come into the werewolf war later, but that mostly just has to do with the fact that, it was just a poison.
I wasn't sure. I thought maybe there was a medicinal. I was like, wow, we're giving people poison.
Well, that's
people
the fascinating part is that it
right?
actually is used as a medicine. If you kind of like process the plant, it's used in Chinese medicine as one of the herbs.
But it sounds like we might have some similar ideas on werewolves, but also some different. Now, I, of course, grew up with the masculine idea of the werewolf. And the idea was usually that this was the uncontrollable person inside that comes out, the socially unacceptable person that would be banished. And so the werewolf comes in, and the full moon is bringing out the craziness. But I was wondering...
Well, there's a long-standing connection with the full moon and there's the term lunacy that comes from the moon itself. There being a lunar, cyclical. What am I trying to say?
Cyclical.
Cyclical
monthly...
nature to a lot of people of the symptoms of the mentally ill. So
you think that there's a real connection between mental illness and cycles of the moon?
It sounds like a little hokey to say that, but I've definitely been around, people with severe mental illnesses who they were definitely on a cycle. Is it monthly? Is it tied specifically to the full moon? I can't say. But there's definitely been sort of re-looking at that. They know that it's tied into, like, there's more car accidents, there's more babies born. Yeah, I'm sorry, but if you go out to 6th Street on a full moon, you're going to hear more of the argle-bargling than you are at just a random time.
Right.
It's almost like there's it's just harder to kind of maybe keep it tamped down. You know, some of those people can't keep it tamped down anyway, but it's just like, it's really like all the stops are off on a full moon.
Do you think that there's one of the things that I've found recently, there was a movie I think came out in like 2002 called Ginger Snaps. And basically, they take the idea of the werewolf and they turn it into a female, a woman side. Instead of masculine, it's more feminine.
It's more like feminist horror movie.
Yeah.
Which is great.
Yeah. So the curse, using the term the curse for both what the werewolf is and the moon phases, seemed as if it was the kind of the way to go. I mean, when we're talking about transformation, there's physical transformation and there's emotional transformation. Right. But the physical transformation for a woman, a teenage girl, is, you know, as much as I hated mine, I would not, for the life of me, want to, you know, oh, now your body's changing into a vessel for another human being,
right?
You know, and you're going to be reminded of that every month with some pain and some blood,
right?
Is there a sexual side to the werewolf in the past? Is there anything? Is there any medicinal?
And the other thing that I can think that would be tied in with werewolves and the full moon and sexuality is that we do run on a monthly cycle,
right?
And in a pre-industrial society, the thing that would be different was the amount of light with the actual full moon during the month, and that there's a theory there that it's like you would come on to your cycle would come on to timing with the moon cycle, like you would ovulate maybe every month at the full moon. So it's like not only are all the crazies going off at the full moon, but all of a sudden people who maybe they weren't, you know, there's a correlation between ovulation and seeking sex, right?
Right.
So that's also a thing that would happen. I'm not saying it doesn't happen now. I'm just saying we're not all like lined up on the same cycle because of all the light pollution and everything else.
Right.
So
but
it would be happening all at the same time. So it's people will be, okay, let's, you know, what's going on?
Get in a bunker.
We're gonna be sneaking out. Like, I'm sure that's part of the whole, you know, talking about, you know, people are sneaking out of the woods to fuck at the same time every, you know, the month.
Right.
Let's watch out for the wolves. Like, maybe that's the...
Right.
You know, like...
Well, it's interesting talking about werewolves because, I mean, obviously we're talking sexuality as well as physical change as well as emotional change. You mentioned that there was a court case that was around werewolfing?
No, there were a whole bunch of them.
Okay, tell me more.
So around the same time as the witch trials, and actually a little earlier, there were werewolf trials. Whereas opposed to the witch trials where most of the victims were women, in the werewolf trials most of the victims were men. And there was at least one case where somebody he was like 14 years old. He's obviously crazy. He's obviously a crazy person. And they pulled him up and charged him with being a werewolf, and he was like, "Yep, I'm the werewolf, and I killed this many people, and this is how I did it." And you know, which doesn't actually make sense with the classical conception of a werewolf, is that you turn into a wolf and you have no memory of what you've done.
Right.
So that's.
So was that by reason of insanity? Was that the first case that actually had a jury say he's off because of reasons of insanity?
I don't think they used the word insanity, but I think they referred him to something other than a death sentence.
Yep, he's a werewolf. He's damned.
He needs to go. He needs to go. Like, we need to go put him in a convent or something like that.
Werewolf prison.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, do you think? We talked about the moon cycles and things, and that I had seen this movie Ginger Snaps.
Oh yeah.
It just seems to make more logical sense that it would be more feminine because of cycles of moon and body change and sexuality, because men being sexual doesn't raise as many eyebrows as women being sexual at that time in a village where all of a sudden the women are just like crazy. Do you think there's a reason that it went from feminine to masculine, or do you think that that just always was masculine?
I think just always was masculine. That there's, I mean, if you look at the kind of the symptoms of what a werewolf is, if you take out the actual wolf part, you're looking at someone with a rage problem. You know, that's not that there couldn't be a woman with that, but that's sort of this classical masculine rage problem. You know, and if you want to tie that to sexuality, you know, you're looking at, you know, a rapist, basically. And if you look at the reports of werewolves in the Middle Ages, and you look at the reports of like, oh, we've got a serial rapist or something, it's the same kind of panic that we get today. Or a serial killer. So if you look at the werewolf is the Middle Ages version of the serial killer. Right? Like...
Or the serial rapist.
Or the serial rapist, but, you know, good luck getting anyone to take a rape seriously anyway.
Right.
But
now, they probably didn't have... Right. They probably didn't have... So now, they probably...
Did you look at the corset she was wearing? You know?
The corset. Fronds. I told her not to leave the house without a 6-inch frond.
You know, but So, I mean, it's interesting to... one of my favorite fairy tales is Little Red Riding Hood, right? You've got the classic, you've got the woman who's just exhibited signs of womanhood. It's when she's wearing a red cape. It's don't stray from the path, and there's a wolf comes and meets you, and, you know, and even at the end of the fairy tale, he goes, you know, not all wolves look like wolves. It's, you know, and it's clearly it's like a story about how to potentially avoid being sexually assaulted. Like, that's what it's about.
Right.
You know.
So it may not be that there's a correlation.
There's a correlation between predatory male sexual behavior and wolves.
Sure. What I was going to say is there may not be a correlation in the Middle Ages of what I'm about to talk about. But since we were talking about violation, we were talking about sexual assault, this whole thing about alien abductions.
Oh, yeah.
So I figure they don't have alien abductions back then. Maybe they did.
But so here's... They didn't have what we would call alien abductions because I don't think they had a concept of, you know...
something out there.
UFOs, people coming from other planets. But they did have a concept of people coming from other realms. So what you do get in that time period is fairy abductions. And the reports of fairy abductions and the reports of alien abductions don't look all that dissimilar. So
that's interesting because when I went to Iceland, I talked to a couple of the people that were there, and pretty much the idea that I got is that 10% believe completely in elves and fairies and the Huldafolk, the hidden people. 10% don't believe at all, and then 80% are like, well, I don't want to tempt fate, so I put out stuff and I stay off of those rocks because they could be fairy houses. Right. So the belief is very much there still. I mean, even if it's not a full-blown thing, but they did talk about how elves are the hated ones. I mean,
fairies are not cute little things with wings flying around for the most part. They're like
elves are even worse.
Scary people from another realm who will come and take you.
So that's the alien abduction of that time.
Absolutely.
Were they as sexual as... I mean, the thing... What do you think of first when you think of alien abduction? The first thing you think of is the anal probe. I mean, maybe I'm the weird one, but pretty much the only thing that people are always like, oh, probing is.
Well, you read these reports where if you're a man, they anal probe you, and then if a woman is abducted, you often read these reports of like they implanted an alien fetus and then later came and re-abducted her and took it away. Which, I mean, if you think of these kind of monster mythology stories as like ways to talk about things that we don't want to talk about, I can't think of anything more like, up until recent times, anal sex and abortion, right? Like,
hello, half the audience leaves immediately.
Right?
Yeah,
you know, like, okay, we have the internet now, so maybe it's a little easier to talk about these things than it used to be. But it's like,
you wanted to clear a room.
Even if you were personally comfortable talking about, up until recently, both of these things are highly illegal activities that you shouldn't admit to having engaged in, right? Right. So it's you still got a lot of discomfort with both of these two subjects for most people to talk about them, right?
Right. So with the elves and the fairies, was there a medicinal thing that was to them as well? Was there stuff that would be done? Was it considered a mental illness? Was it considered a visitation?
I think there's, maybe there's a visitation aspect to it. There was people being abducted. There was certain illnesses that you couldn't explain, which were explained as the elf shot you, or
Really?
Yeah. That's going to be harder to cure because they infected you on a supernatural level. Like.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So the shooting is like a astral bullet.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Wow, that's kind of interesting. I think about that with how folklore does meld into the present, wherever it is. In Iceland, they had the 12 psychotic Santas, basically. They had these 12 guys that existed before Santa, but once the American Navy showed up and came up with this guy and showed this guy,
right,
they kind of incorporated that into these 12 guys that would come and do these crazy things. But one of my friends, when I was talking about this, I was going, they're nuts. It's like one guy eats all your candles, another guy eats your shoes. And he's like, did you notice that all of this is about famine?
Uh-huh.
This is all eating.
What's the underlying underlying fear?
Yeah, what's the underlying fear? And it's all about the food not being there. Is there anything that you can think of for these monsters that we've talked about that is kind of the underlying fear?
Okay, so the correlation between the aliens abducting you and either probing you up the butt or, giving you a creepy alien fetus that has to be aborted is... the fairy times equivalent of that was fairies stealing your baby and replacing it with a fairy baby called a changeling. And it's like, well, what was that about? Well, you would know that your baby was a changeling because it suddenly got sick or wasn't well or, started behaving differently or, so I think the underlying fear there was just around just the high levels of infant mortality.
I was just going to say mortality must have been huge.
Yeah.
So that was the way that,
it's like a way of coping.
Fetal death.
Yeah, SIDS. We have SIDS now, or whatever. They're still calling it that. But it's your baby just suddenly up and dies, and no one can explain why.
And that's because it's not really your baby.
It's not really your baby.
It was a
replacement baby. Yeah,
cover
exactly.
While they're taking the baby.
It was fake
away.
news.
It's fake news. So, in closing on this, is there anything that you wanted to talk about with medicine and the spirit world or the monsters that we know that would be something that you'd like the listeners to know?
Oh, so in like researching herbs and sacred plants and so tobacco, sacred herb of the Native Americans, and we have a pretty clear association. Oh, it gives you lung cancer. It does all these terrible things to you. But it also is really, really good at keeping down symptoms of schizophrenia. So they're actually going to phase out the term schizophrenia, but what you might think of that is like people having delusions of, to the point where medical words were like, you can't, or psychological words in hospitals were like, you can't ban smoking. We need to let them smoke. So it's fascinating to me that a plant that would treat those kinds of psychological symptoms is like also had gotten into our knowledge as like a sacred plant, a plant that will, bless you and keep negative things off you. So it's like that kind of correlation that's super fascinating to me.
Yeah. Well, Julie Vayda, thank you so much for being on the show and talking about all of this. I really appreciate you giving us your insights on this. And I want to thank everybody for listening. And until next time, stay hell-bent. Hell-bent! Hell-bent! And thanks for listening to the show. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lisa Gorski. You can find more on our website, hellbentforhorror.com, and I'm also on Facebook at facebook.com/hellbentforhorror, and my Twitter handle is hellbenthorror. You can find Hellbent for Horror on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher, and other podcast platforms. And H4H has its own app. You can download it from the Google or Amazon store for Android, and the iPhone version is available on the iTunes store. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay hell-bent.